Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Food Literacy for All. Tonight we have Ozawa, Bineshi, Albert talking about community food systems for climate justice. As always, we are grateful to our sponsors. Food Literacy for All is brought to you by the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative. Huge support from the Center for the Education of Women, Residential College, Dr. Kyle White, Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the School of Public Health, the School of Environment and Sustainability, and the Department of American Culture. Our teaching team is co-led by Shakira Tyler, myself, Jessica Kenyatta Walker, and Lily Fink Shapiro. We are also supported by our two GSIs, Megan Gross and Nayexi Hernandez, as well as Kimmy Vandewedge, who is our coordinator, and Chris Taylor, who is our LSA technology support.
Hello, everyone. We have received a few questions about your end of term capstone assignment. So I wanted to get you guys started thinking about things as hardier, longer projects, to which project 1 and 2 were only appetizers. And so we encourage you to get started and reach out to us with questions as soon as possible. I also want to remind you that GSI evaluations on myself and Nayexi to our department are live, and the link for that can be found in your announcements as well as here in the chat, which I will paste afterwards. Unrelated to class, students on campus have organized a summit called Rooting for Change, which is about food. You can see here, there's several events happening later this week, and I will also post a link in the chat shortly where you can find that. In other campus events, this is for the students. You may have heard that the Graduate Employers Organization, or GEO, is voting this week to authorize a strike that could begin as early as next week. This strike will impact every single student at the University of Michigan. If you or any of your fellow students are interested in learning more about the Graduate Employers Organization, why they're striking, and what it will mean for every student, please follow the link posted in the chat for resources, as well as an invitation to an informal info session. Feel free to share this link with any interested students, as all students have a right to know what is happening on campus and why. GEO wants students to know that while the strike directly affects them, the strike is a response to administration and does not find any fault with the students. Please follow and share this link. Remember that we're here as your GSIs to support you in the class and in your education in general, and want to be able to support you with any questions that you may have. So I'm going to post that here in the chat shortly. And for now, I'm going to pass it back to Jessica.
As always, food literacy is free and open to the public. Tell your friends and tell your family. Students, especially, remember to attend with your UMich email address, and community attendees. There are optional readings that are available on the SFSI website. Tweet at us some takeaways, questions, hashtag food literacy for all at SFSI at Poll questions each class are for your attendance and participation. We count 2 polls toward that. All classes are filmed and available on the SFSI website, and closed caption is always available on Zoom. If you have any questions at any point throughout the presentation, please go ahead and submit them with the Q&A box. We will get to those during our discussion portion. Again, at any point during the presentation, if you want to submit a question, please do so by using the Q&A box. Next week, we have Liz Carlisle and Latrice Taxty on March 28th, 2023, Healing Grounds, Climate Justice, and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. So make sure to tune in and register for that. And a reminder that our April 4th class is in person, location to be announced, but please keep an eye on your Canvas. And we will also firm that up for our next session. But April 4th class, please plan to be in person on campus. A reminder about summer internship fellowships for the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative. This is open to master students at a $3,000 stipend, and applications are due by April 1st. You can learn more on the SFSI website. Save the date, May 19th, 2023, this year, for the Michigan Good Food Summit in East Lansing, Michigan. And I will pass it off to Lily.
All right. Hey, everybody. So this is such an honor to host and to get to introduce Ozawa Bineshi Albert here tonight at Food Literacy for All. And I was just thinking back to over the summer when Jessica Shikara and I were first planning this course, and then we had collectively decided on this theme of food, power, and the climate crisis. One of the very first people who we invited to speak in the class was Ozawa Bineshi Albert. And I think that's because for more than 30 years, she has worked on environmental justice and Indigenous rights. Bineshi is currently a co-executive director at CJA, the Climate Justice Alliance, which she co-leads with 2 other women of color. And over the last 3 decades, Bineshi has contributed to the work of It Takes Roots, the rising majority in international movement spaces. Bineshi supported the creation and development of both an Indigenous feminist organizing school and an international feminist organizing school. She's actually our second that I know of food literacy speaker this semester who began her organizing work with Greenpeace. I'll leave it to you to figure out who else we've had who had Greenpeace involvement. And she holds a degree in Indigenous Liberal Studies from the Institute of American Indian Art. She's a proud mother of 3, as well as a grandmother. She currently makes her home in relocated Yuchi and Muskogee territory in Oklahoma, also known as Tulsa. And this brief synopsis that I just gave you really only covers this small fraction of the impressive and interesting things about our speaker this evening. So in an effort to share a little bit more about her, here's a quick poll question for you all. So which of the following is not true about Ozawa Bineshi Albert? A, she was a founding board member of the Indigenous Environmental Network, IEN. B, one title she's held in her long career was a movement building coordinator. C, she loves to dance. D, organizing for community and Indigenous rights was a part of her childhood. E, she has authored 2 children's books. F, she has written 3 plays. Or do you think it's G, she was a founder of the Native American Voters Alliance? And we'll give you another maybe 20, 25 seconds or so to respond. I'm starting to see the answers come in, which is always fun. They seem to be kind of spread across the board. And then with that, I will welcome Bineshi. You are, in fact, maybe you should tell them. She has not seen this before right now, so it's possible I'm wrong, but maybe Bineshi, you should share.
I should have offered you a few too. One of them would have been, I used to be a dancing bear. So anytime you see me on the street somewhere, you should ask me about that story, because I'm not going to do it now. But the answer that I will say on here actually is only halfway remotely not true. Which is I have not authored 2 children's books, but I have 2 children's book in progress that I'm trying to work on with my daughter.
Wow, I almost checked that with you ahead of time. I had no idea. Awesome.
We haven't done it yet, but I have I have a grandson, right? And my daughter teaches in our tribal language, so I have been thinking about these children's books quite frequently.
That's really special. Well, 44% of people did not think that you have written 3 plays, so feel free to address it or not. I will exit now and pass the mic to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you all. I was saying before we got on the call, this has been a long time coming. I was very excited about the initial invitation, which was way last summer. And yes, my time has gotten a little busy since I became co-director at Climate Justice Alliance. So I'm glad I have the moment to be here with you all today. So I lost some color here. So yeah, some of this was already part of the introduction. I'm Yuchi and Anishinaabe. My mother is from Southern Ontario, and my father is from Oklahoma, which is where Yuchi people currently are. But we were relocated from the Southeast. So I am now in relocated Yuchi Muskogee territory in Tulsa. And yeah, almost 2 years ago now, I became one of the co-directors at the Climate Justice Alliance. Helped create, as a young person, organizing as a young person, helped create the Indigenous Environmental Network. Spent a good many years fighting sacred site preservation work in fighting for sacred site preservation work in New Mexico. And then I took a break and went to school and went to the Institute of American Indian Arts, which you heard those two degrees. But strangely enough, I actually studied ethnobotany for a bit of time and almost made a career shift and change to do that. And so, yeah, a lot of the environmental justice work and climate change work for me has come from, a cultural upbringing around being connected to land and that relationship to land. So, and so that's how I got to be here with y'all, or even on a short list of folks to like come and talk about climate change and food systems. And so, y'all, I'm sure, have been through a lot of this already, but just, how did we get here into this moment of like the climate crisis that we're in? I like to start from the beginning of like Columbus landing on the shores of, the Caribbean and what that impact meant. That moment of time in history was a time of sort of imperialism, land grabs from a lot of countries, a lot of governments, and just trying to accumulate as much land as possible. And so, when Columbus came to the shores here, not only was there a lot of sort of destruction and degradation in the search for gold and spices, but there was also some concepts that came to the Americas that we're still dealing with the effects of. One of those concepts is this concept of dominion. And dominion, comes from the church, but it's a concept about man being over nature, and a concept that removes man or puts man above of nature, and nature being sort of inert and resources to be acquired, accumulated, extracted, and exploited. And so that was a concept that was contrary to, or dramatically different than the concepts that were held by the indigenous peoples of this Western hemisphere around sort of relationship of land, and peoples generally see themselves not as dominant over land or nature or animals or any, but that they're in sort of equal relationship with. And so this is where you often hear people talk about a concept of indigenous peoples being sort of circular thinkers, but also just this more egalitarian sort of thinking about its relationship with land. So when you come from that perspective of relationship to land, nature, and relationship literally being that animal is my relative, that tree is my relative, that rock is my relative, then you think about what happens to relatives in a much different way. And so what we have now then are the effects of that concept of dominion that came with Columbus to this country of like, oh, the land is a resource to be used, to be exploited, versus whatever happens to the land also happens to us. And so there was that. The second image I have here is just around like, what were the actual effects of colonization? There was mass deforestation, to create space for farmlands, to, create roadways to get to whatever lost city they were looking for, but also to create trade, expand trade routes, which, there had been many trade routes before, but to expand and build on those and start building sort of encampments, which became towns, which became cities, right? And, during that time, especially as we get into the US context, there were a lot of things that started to change around management of land, around what did what was happening with the land and what were the effects of that to the larger sort of the ecology in places. And so, you can find text of, explorers in the time that came to what is known now as the United States in that area. And they will tell you that, some of those texts, describe forests, that people being able to like walk through them and, see lots of wildlife going. And it's because those forests were managed. They were managed by people in communities who, needed to, create meadows and fields and places where they could hunt and then create where wildlife would come through. And that meant that they had to sort of manage forest areas and, and take care of them. And, once that first sort of contact came through the US, a lot of people died, right? A lot of indigenous people by the thousands were gone. And so some of those same historical texts that you go through, say 60, 80 years later, they talk about how the forest was thick and they couldn't even take horses through there, and they had to walk through those forests because they had become all overgrown and nobody was managing them anymore because the people had been lost to disease and other destructive practices. And most of this I will talk about in sort of general areas as, impacts around like environmental justice and how that impacts people of color. And, from personally, I'm an Indigenous woman, so a lot of the frame of references that I will have will be from that point of view as well. So, the next sort of wave of shift that happened was around industrialization and oil boom. And, so we're going into the sort of 1900s and much further. And the impacts to indigenous communities, people were moved. They were moved from their traditional homelands to other lands, Oklahoma being one of those places. Indian Territory was supposed to be one giant reservation where they removed Indian people from a lot of other places to here to the state. There are 39 tribes here in Oklahoma. Only 2 of them are originally from here. And gave people allotments of land, and tried to instill the sort of practices of assimilation of like, all right, we're going to give you a parcel of land, and it's yours, you own it, you can do with it what you want. We want you to farm, become farmers. And, and these were people who, one, had already been farmers, but also, gathered in their traditional communities, but were removed and moved somewhere else where plant life was different, wildlife was different, and having to figure out how to navigate that. And sometimes also told, no, you cannot hunt because you can't own a gun, you can't own weapons. And indigenous people, even though there is a Bureau of Indian Affairs now within the US government, initially that existed in the War Department. Right, that particular agency existed as part of the War Department of the US. And so that was the initial relationship with indigenous peoples. And so once people had that land and had to shift like how they were gathering food, what they were gathering, what they were eating, and sometimes also being only given rations from the army, lots of grain, flour, mostly, sometimes beans, but just, given rations because they were moved from their homelands, and had to figure out how do we acquire food now in a new place when the animals are different, the area is different, the landscape is different. And so sometimes had to depend on the government for food sources. So they move into this time frame of ownership of land, and then oil was discovered, right? And so then became this time frame of like, we're going to take all of this land from what had been allotted to all these families and offer people, very minuscule amounts of money for large tracts of land, once they discovered that there was oil on those places. And there's lots of books and stories about that time period and about, what the oil boom did to indigenous peoples and other peoples in terms of land acquisitions and land grabs. There's even a Scorsese movie that is supposed to be coming out, was supposed to be out some time ago, but it was filmed here in in Oklahoma, about, the deaths and murders that were happening in terms of acquiring land once oil was discovered. And then the last image I have there is just of the deforestation that continues to happen today, both for pulp, for paper products, but also for clearing land for large scale commercial farming, and what that has done and continues to do to our environment, the ecology of where people are at in different places where this is a very prominent. I'm in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma used to be full of a lot more trees and brush, and a lot of that is now farmland, and monocrop kind of farms, large scale crops. And so some of these things keep continuing from, the initial time of colonization to the continued colonization that is happening. We often talk about this idea of carbon colonization and what's happening with that. So I'll get into that in a little bit. So I work with CJA, Climate Justice Alliance. Climate Justice Alliance is an alliance of now 89 member organizations, and came together some years ago, almost 10 years ago now. We're about to have our 10-year anniversary, and came together with a group of environmental justice organizations primarily, who were discussing and talking at great length about like what was happening with climate change, and trying to be at the table in some of these places where discussions were happening, and often finding that they were either the only person of color or brown person in the room for some of these discussions. But even on an international scale, finding some of that as well in some of the international spaces around discussions around climate change, and said, like, we need to have more frontline communities, those communities who are directly impacted by the industries and facilities that are making great contributions to the climate crisis. We need to have them at the tables to talk about solutions. So that's a little bit about Climate Justice Alliance. And these are just a few of sort of ways that we try to do the work, is fighting the bad, building the new. It's like, what are the sort of bad policies, industries, polluting and extraction that has happened that is causing harm, but also building the new. What are the solutions, just solutions that people want to see in their community? What's happening? How can we support that? Changing the rules is about policy. How do we shift and change about the rules as it comes to climate change, and shifting that. Moving the money is about how do we like resource the sort of community efforts that people are doing, and resource solutions that are making great impact. Building the bigger we is, connecting with other communities, other coalitions, alliances to like build momentum in the work that we're doing. And then changing the story is like, how do we get people to start thinking and talking about climate change, and what does that mean? How do we get them to talk about climate justice, and what does that mean? And I've been in this long enough to remember a time when people did not say the words climate justice. And so to like think about it now in the political context of what's happening, it's very encouraging, and also frustrating that we're still talking about some of the same things that we were talking about some years ago. And so CJA came together to like, try to make sure that communities of color, impacted communities, frontline communities, fence line communities, were at these spaces where climate policy, where climate decisions about the climate crisis were being discussed and decided, and wanting to make sure that there was a balance of not just big green conservation type organizations, but also thinking about like, what does this mean to actually communities and impacted communities? And, you know, there was a time period, I think we're a little bit past that now, but I remember a time period whenever climate, you know, this idea of climate change was a far off thing. People would talk about it in the context of 100 years from now or 50 years from now. We've now like gone from 30 years to like, oh, this is on us right now. And you've probably heard other presentations or people have said that, like we're talking about like the crisis is immediate. However, for a lot of communities, they've been dealing with the crisis for decades. Everything from you know, pollution from industries and facilities that are, you know, polluting their waterways or the air to you know, increase incidences of health conditions, particularly asthma and other ailments that have to do with breathing, but also, you know, displacement from, you know, both like, hey, we need to put a, you know, a big oil field here, so we're going to move everybody out of here, to also displacement from sea level rise. And what happens when a community who's lived in a space for millennia have to move because their village is falling into the ocean, right? And so for many communities, they've been dealing with the climate crisis for decades. And so it's not a, you know, a long off far thing to like be dealt with in the future or to be dealt with any calmness. They are looking at this from the perspective of like the urgency of like, we need to reduce the harm now. So, you know, part of the work around building the bigger we is, you know, thinking about what is it we're trying to build towards, right? What do we want? What are we trying to get to? And so we worked with a number of organizations, other frontline organizations. And when I say frontline communities or frontline organizations, I mean those who live along the fence line of oil, gas extraction or processing facilities. I also mean frontline when we talk about those who are dealing with immediate health, physical health, or land-based destruction in their immediate sense. So that's what I mean when I say frontline communities. So we worked with a number of other organizations who work with frontline communities to create what we call the People's Orientation for Regenerative Economy. What is it that we want to build towards? What do we want to see happen? What are the areas that are important to us? So y'all should look for this People's Orientation for Regenerative Economy. You can find it on CJA's website. You can also find it on the United Frontline Table website. And there's a number of pillars there that have to do with looking at the climate crisis, but also looking at it in the different ways that it affects people. So there's a piece there around Indigenous communities and Indigenous sovereignty. There's a piece there around Black liberation. There's a piece there about food sovereignty and what does that mean. There's stuff there around, you know, feminist economy. And so there's a number of pillars there that are important, because what, you know, why CJA came together, another reason is that a lot of the discussion that was happening and a lot of the discussion that's happening now about the climate crisis is to think about the climate crisis as a crisis of carbon and reducing carbon. And absolutely true that needs to be addressed, but it's not the only way that the climate crisis is affecting people. And so when we think about like solutions and even false solutions, part of that is, you know, shifting that thinking of like, oh, this is only a crisis of carbon, but that this is a crisis of harm that is happening to communities. And so here's an example a way that maybe people don't think about the climate crisis. So climate change has effect on weather patterns, right? It affects food. And I'm sure you've had other presentations where it affects the food systems, growing seasons. What does that look like, right? And that happens with the shift and changes in weather. What also can happen is that what is actually naturally growing out in the environment is also being challenged or having impact. So I lived a good number of years in New Mexico, and people's access to be able to pick piñons, which was a staple food for a number of indigenous peoples of the Southwest. Piñons growing these little scrubby trees, and they're really struggling to be able to continue to find piñons and healthy trees because they're being overtaken by beetles, and the beetles are flourishing because of shifts in weather patterns, and winters are a lot more mild and a lot shorter, so they don't kill off enough of the beetles, and then the beetles, proliferate, and then they wipe out lots of trees. So that's one, right? Another is, from my community, we have a number of traditional medicines that we use for our ceremonies, and those are becoming harder and harder to find. One, because of development of land, but also just because of the confusion of seasons. And so if the plant grows too early and then there's another cold snap, then that plant gets destroyed, and then there's not a healthy crop, and that can accumulate and build over decades, right? So that it continues to diminish being able to access those lands. So then it's like, oh, we don't have that medicine to use in our ceremony. And there's a shift, and a cultural shift that then has to happen because we can't access that one plant for a particular medicine, and that's no longer available for us, right? That's a climate impact to a culture of a people. There's impacts to people's access to food, to like I said, to displacement because of land development, or also displacement, particularly for coastal communities, to sea level rise. And what does that mean? So the people's orientation was a way for us to say, all right, we know what we're fighting against. What are we fighting for? What do we want to see happen? What do we want to make sure happens? And so this is a set of values, platform sort of here's where we would like to see some things happen, both in policy, but also in practice in communities. How does this look, and what's happening, or what can happen, and what's the possibilities for our communities going forward? And so that is there. Y'all should take a look. And then, in terms of fighting against and fighting the bad, we, have this sort of thinking about false solutions, right? And I've always struggled with the term false solutions because it still, sort of indicates that there's a potential solution. But it's really, they're really sort of initiatives that are being promoted as ways to address the climate crisis, but they're not really addressing the harms that are actually happening right now. They're really looking at initiatives from a place of economy, or leading with the economy. And the economy is absolutely important. And, when I think about the impacts to communities of color and poor communities who are already living in poverty, many times, the healthy economy is absolutely important. But at the same time, I think about a number of the communities who are dealing with actual health harms, whether that be like they don't have clean water to drink, or they live next to an oil refinery, or another refinery that is spewing out stuff in their neighborhoods, or the communities where people can light their lawns because of the fuel that is leaked out into their neighborhoods. Like that's a different sort of set of priorities to think about when we're talking through solutions. And so for us, when we try to think about, you know, what is a priority or should be a priority for, you know, policymakers, whether that be local, state, federal, even international, we try to think about like solutions that are the opposite of this, right? So false solutions are generally extractive and generally maintain the status quo of wealth and accumulation and political power. False solutions are also, you know, continue to allow poisoning or, you know, displacement or oppression of communities. False solutions, again, you know, reduce the climate crisis to just a crisis of carbon. And so, you know, these are always things that we're thinking about, both as CJA, but for a number of EJ environmental justice organizations is like, listen, we have to be able to hold our lawmakers accountable to policies that lead with how do we reduce the harms to actual people, and how do we reduce the harms to land and water, and how do we like move with the pace, a policy pace that is with the urgency of reducing harm. And so there's a number of things that are floating out there right now in terms of our current administration that are happening in a number of states, that are happening, you know, being promoted by a number of very well-intended environmental organizations, scientists, all of them, like lots of lovely things that like, it sounds good when you first hear about it, like, oh yes, let's figure out how to erase carbon from the atmosphere. Absolutely. But what is happening with those initiatives? Like what if we like dig a little deeper, what is happening? What are they solutions that are creating more harms? Are they solutions that are actually shifting and undoing systems of wealth and unequal wealth distribution in our country and in other places, and political power? So there's a bazillion false solutions out there. These are just a couple of examples, and maybe you know, when we get into a question and answer point, like people might have questions about some of these. Carbon markets and offsets are so popular and people love it, and every, you know, music company and airline are saying, hey, you know, we're helping you create a zero carbon footprint. Where does that carbon go? How does it go there? But also, is it actually reducing the production of carbon? Or is it just saying carbon can be produced at the same rate as long as we find somewhere it can go and we can trade with that community of people, with that government, with their forest? This is creating a lot of problems in a lot of communities. Look at the example of the Amazon. The indigenous people of the Amazon are being sold lots of promises about, like, if you just let us use your forest as an offset, which is already a carbon offset, which is already a carbon offset, but it says, if you let us use your forest for that, we can give you this amount of money. But in the end, it's still allowing, you know, refineries that exist here in Oklahoma, that exist in you know, Richmond, California, to continue to pollute. And what does that mean when you're then having community against community really struggling? And so, and communities are connecting now. They're connecting and talking about these things. CCS, carbon capture sequestration, carbon capture utilization and sequestration. Lovely, sounds great on the front end of it, like, oh, let's figure out how to capture the carbon and take it out of the atmosphere and then put it somewhere or repurpose it and use it. Some of these technologies are new. They're so new that we haven't even figured out what, you know, their impacts are yet, and the environmental impacts. What does it mean when we sink that level of carbon back into the ground? There's some, you know, I'm in the heart of fracking country here in Oklahoma, and some of this stuff sounds really crazy when they say, oh, well, we're going to like do this and insert things back into the earth. And it's like really, kind of scary thinking about it. But we're still waiting for the studies for the, like, is this really going to work? And are there, secondary effects? And what does that mean? Similarly with agricultural sequestration, lots of big promises. And the hard part with this one is like, there's lots of big promises of financial incentives for small struggling farmers. Absolutely. Like absolutely, small farmers in the Southwest, brown indigenous people in the Southwest, indigenous Black folks in the Southeast, all over, struggling farmers are like, hey, this is a way that we could like pull ourselves, out of debt, out of, and be successful. And, thinking about like, what does it mean for soil to regenerate itself? And are we allowing enough time for that? Are we also looking at the larger system, particularly when we're looking at monocrops? Are we giving the soil enough time to regenerate? And can that sequestration actually be effective in those situations? But also, how do we create the investment into small farmers and to more localized farming? And how do we create the financial systems to support that happening? And then bioengineering, and this is some scary stuff, when you think about like, oh, can we create a super tree that will eat more carbon than it used to? And are we creating like Frankenstein plant life to do that and to do that work? And, what does it happen? What happens when those trees or plants become food for other animals? What happens to those animals? What happens to further up the line? Are some of those actually into the food systems that go into our food systems, right? Like, and so I know there's a lot of science that says, oh, there's so much potential here. And there's also so much that we don't know about, that bioengineering around, forest and crops and different things and what can happen. And it's scary, right? And so it's, a lot of these are still built on the idea that like, okay, carbon can continue to be produced at the rate that it is. Let's just find ways to erase it from the atmosphere once it's created. Versus where I think a better strategy is, how about we stop producing as much carbon and figuring out ways to not produce as much carbon, and then come back to some of these strategies to figure out how to like add to that. Because right now, if we continue, even with all of these as potential initiatives or solutions, we are still producing at a rate that outdoes what we can actually erase from the atmosphere in the time we're at. And, I was talking earlier about, climate change being something in the future. There's many scientists who say like that 0 hour time clock. Some are like, that's much quicker than we thought. It used to be 30 years out. Now people are saying 10 years out. And there are a few scientists who are saying 2 or 3 years out before we hit a tipping point of no return. And so how do we take much more sort of drastic thinking about what we should be doing and look at like, how do we look at initiatives and solutions from a place of how do we reduce the most harm versus how do we reduce harm while still making profit and making money? So just a little bit thinking about false solutions. Wow, lost something here. I don't know, but fight the bad. Fight the bad is like, I talked about most of this, which is just some of the policies that exist out there right now. And, what is happening. Some of the things that are here is, thinking about the sort of the policies that are coming down right now from the current administration here in the US. Everything from, smart agriculture, carbon offset sort of schemes that are happening, thinking about also market-based solutions to carbon. I talked about those a little bit, like, how are we trading pollution for profit? I mean, that's literally, I mean, we call it like carbon markets, but you're saying we're selling pollution for profit. And in a system where you have communities saying, oh, we're going to switch out, then you create a dependency for that pollution to exist. And I talked a little bit about industrial agriculture, large scale commercial agriculture, and the long-term effects that we already know about and have seen, the long-term effects of what does that mean, both to the food systems, but also to the soil and the regeneration of the soil and the effectiveness of soil to naturally absorb carbon, and switch that out. And now that is happening at a much slower pace, even all the while, like there's initiatives and being asked to say, hey, let's, move this agriculture versus investment into localized small scale farming. And, just thinking about like, these the large industrial farms and the displacement of workers for some of these places, in terms of, a lot of the large scale is done by large machines with fewer people. And then, small community farms are really struggling to stay afloat. So sorry that slide went MIA. I don't know what happened there, but oh, well, there they are. So yes, carbon offsets. Yeah, this is really thinking about like the market-based solutions, which are the like darlings of the environmental field of work, but at the same time is not really in alignment with what is happening in communities, and it's not in alignment with creating real systems of food sovereignty and food security even, and is contrary to sort of regenerative, localized community farming. Regenerative agriculture is organic farming is becoming something that is a little bit more co-opted around like sort of the large scaleness, like we can do this at large scale, which sort of displaces local farmers and farming. And then I said the thing about farm workers and farmers just being exposed to a lot, both in terms of exposure to a lot of chemicals, pesticides, fungicides, all of that to maintain the large scale industrial farming to other, exposures and deportation and exploitation, and moving into, them having to leave their home communities and countries. So this was some stuff around just the number of like greenhouse gas emissions. It's a little bit of old data here, but just thinking through the possibilities of where some of that is coming from. And so in what is there, you see where the production is coming from, both transportation, electricity, and industry is like the most in terms of creating, the greenhouse gases that we're dealing with. Agriculture creates greenhouse gases as well, just through its production, and then commercial and residential, right? And it's interesting because that's one of the smaller chunks there is at 12%, is residential, but there's this narrative that is created of as long as we all do our part, right? That it's an individual responsibility to deal with the climate crisis, as opposed to holding accountable industry, production of electricity, the transportation, and the transportation of even food from different places and long distances. It is, some of the largest contributors to the greenhouse gases that we're dealing with. So yeah, I want to take a pause here and just think a little bit. Yeah, let's both. There's a couple questions we can get into, and then talk a little bit more about some potential solutions. Do I have the question? I have the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Bineshi. I can facilitate the Q&A. Did you want to do the last poll or?
Let's do, yeah, I would go ahead and do both of them. And I'll do the last part of this around some community solutions, and then we can do Q&A after that.
Sounds good.
So this first question here, y'all see it, but what is food sovereignty? I'm sure you've heard this question a number of times, but the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food, like, or where you're at, do you get the food that your people culturally traditionally ate? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. Do you have, is it the right to define one's own agricultural and food distribution systems? Is it a political framework? Is this just a concept for politicians and lawmakers? Is food sovereignty a people's climate movement? Is food sovereignty all of the above or none of the above? I think that this one around like food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods is an interesting one, because it's not just, it's funny that like we have such a movement around organic foods, but 50, 60 years ago, all food was organic. All food was organic because people weren't using chemical fertilizers or pesticides. So lovely, 69% said all of the above. And it really is. I mean, there's an aspect of all of this in food sovereignty. And food sovereignty, I also think about food sovereignty as food security. Are we, do we have what we need? And we've just experienced this in COVID lockdown just a mere few years ago, right? Like, do people have what they need to live or how they need to, and have the food available to them? Even during that time, my partner is a farmer, small farm. We grow food, and even in that situation, I would probably have enough food to feed my family for 2-3 months at the most. So what happens then? Our whole culture and identity has changed around how we access and source food. And so when I think about food sovereignty, I also think about it like, am I secure in knowing how I can access food for the long term? I may have the financial means to purchase what I need to, but that food comes from somewhere. And if those systems of transporting food ended or ceased, would I have access to food for my family? So that's another way to think about food sovereignty. There's another question that's a little more specific. I'm going to see if we can get that one. Yeah, so this is a little bit what I was saying just about accessibility. Do I have access? Do you have access? Which of any of the food accessibility options exist in your community? You have fresh produce options. There are food market vendors within walking distance, diversity in vendors and sellers, options to grow your own food and distribute them as you need to. Can I share food with others? Culturally appropriate food. Do you have access to ingredients that are relevant to you as a culture or ethnic group? Participation in food access decisions or distribution of food, locally grown food. seed trading, or none of the above? Are you in a situation where you don't have access to any of these? Curious to know. Seed trading is an interesting one. There's not, there was a time when people did trade seeds all the time, and there's definitely a movement to do that again. But in terms of large scale farming, there's only a few or one corporation who sells the seeds for certain crops that we depend on in this country. Ta-da! Wow, that's good. I've lived in many neighborhoods, particularly urban areas. Would be interesting to break down this question, because in urban areas, there's often a difference in the quality of fresh produce that you can get in communities, and depending on the sort of economic level of a neighborhood. Food markets, good. Diversity in sellers, cool. Options to grow your own food and distribute as needed. I'm going to share a story a little bit later about a challenge with this, about food distribution, growing food and distributing it. Culturally appropriate food, I love that's at least over 50%. And then participation in food access or decisions. We don't always get to decide as citizens about where our food comes from, or what happens to food. And so this is a interesting breakdown of just, how we think about not only food, but some of these are related to systems that are also contributors to, the greenhouse gases that we're dealing with. So the question about culturally appropriate foods is a mixed bag, because it's important to being able to have access to what you need to, and sometimes those foods are coming long distances, and there is a cost. There's a fuel cost, a carbon cost to those foods coming long distances. But the food systems that we have right now are also sometimes creating or adding to the problem of the climate crisis. So the large scale farming is one of those, and I know there's lots of initiatives out there around solutions, some that I might call false solutions, around using agriculture to help the climate crisis, but also creating other secondary problems. And then there is this thing around food distribution. So, one of the organizations is a member of the Climate Justice Alliance, is the Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque. And they have an initiative called Project Feed the Hood. And, teaching gardening and farming to young people, to children, to kids in elementary and middle schools and high schools across the city of Albuquerque. And these beautiful, lovely gardens that kids were learning, science and ecology and, food systems, all this, and they were creating all this food that they were growing and doing, and they couldn't serve the food in the schools because of health codes about where foods come from. And so it's just a really interesting thing to think of, oh, you would think the kids just grew this on the campus, on the grounds of their schools, but they couldn't serve the food in their schools. And so, the organization took that on as a policy shift that needed to happen. And they're still working on some of that, and they've made some gains, but they're still working on that. How do we then create more access and pathways for fresh food to get into community spaces and do that? And so it was just an interesting piece about how there's all these other sort of policies around food and health and quality of food that also have impact on climate. And this country, along with others, we might be the leading country in terms of the amount of food waste that we create. And that waste, much of it goes into landfills that, creates methane and lots of other greenhouse gases. And but also the amount of waste and its impact to poor people, and people having access to food, and we're throwing away so much food, and at the same time there are so many people going hungry in this country, and this is all related to climate as well. So I have a couple pieces here to just continue to share in the slides, just about like some solutions, but I think maybe we could go into a couple of questions first, and then I'll share some other ideas about solutions. If people have questions, I don't know who will hold the questions for us.
Cool. Yeah, let's jump right into it. Thanks, Bineshi. That was so phenomenal. And I always enjoy listening to you and learning with you. It's really helpful information as we dissect these issues. So the first one, do you think the bipartisan infrastructure law will help, or what do you think is missing so it's not a false solution?
Oh goodness, this is a whole nother like session all in itself, right? There are plenty of false solutions in that bipartisan infrastructure like bill. There's some good stuff, but by far there's far more harmful stuff than good stuff. The same with the Inflation Reduction Act. There's some good stuff in there that communities, grassroots communities, even EJ communities fought for, and they tied it with a bunch of other really bad things too, right? And so I get hopeful when I see the word bipartisan. Is like, all right, we're going to put politics aside and like do something together. And then, still a lot of that is led by industry and the needs of industry. And so, yes, there's a potential. And here's where the potential lies, though, is that in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is a lot of money that will be invested into communities. And so the opportunity is for, that money going to states, to going to counties, and that the opportunity is also a challenge in that communities, grassroots organizations, frontline organizations are going to have to like watch and engage in how that money is going to come to their communities, because there is a number of policies in there that will also still be are written in such a way that they would be accessible to corporations, right? And there's a lot of stuff that is to benefit corporations, and then there's a lot of stuff that you would think would go more into sort of community agriculture, localized farming, creating water systems, acequia systems, like all those kind of things. But they still then can be used by a corporation saying, oh, well, we need access to a water pipeline at this scale so that we can pipe water for cooling ponds for, coal fire plants. Right. And so it's a mixed bag, but I think there is some opportunity there, where particularly it comes to opportunity where citizens and communities can advocate, this is how we want this infrastructure to be invested in our community, and to start holding accountable their local and state and federal representatives to make sure that goes to community and development of community, and not just to building out infrastructure for corporations.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's the name of the game, right? And
Absolutely.
we're out of time. There's no more stalling. So
Yeah.
let's get it done.
And let's not forget, like, that infrastructure money is public money. Public meaning of the people, belonging to the people. That money is coming from our communities and needs to go back to our communities.
For sure. Yes. Returning the stolen wealth. Love it. So we just have a little bit more time. Let's keep the questions coming. So to veggie back on the previous one, what is your opinion about manure digesters as a fall solution?
Yeah, I couldn't go into depth of manure digesters. um, in any depth of like the functionality of it. I will say if it's not tied to an actual like reduction of production of carbon, then it's probably a false solution. If you can create policy that says, hey, this manure digester is going to help offset this amount. And additionally, we want it to make sure that it also ends the production of this amount. I think that puts us in a better position than just saying, all right, well, we're going to continue to produce and here's a solution that could possibly like offset some of that. We don't want just offset. We want reduction or elimination of production of carbon.
Yeah, thank you for unpacking that for us. Can you speak to your endeavors in the Arctic environments and or other countries? And I know this is a really hot topic, given the Biden's administration's approval of Arctic drilling. Yeah, recently. Yeah, so please bless us with all of that.
Man, like, it's the Wild West in Alaska and the Arctic. And I think people think, oh, it's so desolate. There's so few people that live there. It's okay for us to exploit or for us to extract from the area. And there's, they're just seeing the dollar signs of what is there. But there's real people that live there, like real people who live there, and people who are not dependent on grocery stores, who are not, there are people who live subsistently. And to say, oh, we're going to, expand this sort of oil field drilling development in a like tremendously huge monumental way that is going to change the ecology of that area so dramatically that people will have to become dependent on grocery stores, and because they won't be able to live subsistently, like real people, not just a few people, but people who've been living there for millennia, who were like, didn't need anybody's help to help them survive Arctic winters, are now going to have to, try to sustain themselves through, other food systems that are causing them so many health problems. And it's expensive. A gallon of milk in Alaska is not the same as a gallon of milk in Detroit. Like, it really isn't. But the challenge is continues to be both this administration and several administrations saying, hey, we want to address the climate crisis, and this is a crisis and we should be doing more things, and the environment is a priority. And then in the same breath saying, oh, but we're going to do these projects, right? Who does the project benefit, right? And I think, it's shameful for sure. It's shameful for sure, but there are some really strong folks there that I know in Alaska who are going to keep fighting and protecting what they need. They're going to keep fighting and protecting the birthing grounds for the caribou that they lived on for millennia. They're going to keep fighting that, the water remains clean so that they can continue to fish and do what they need to do to keep their communities fed. They're going to keep fighting, and there's a whole lot of folks who are going to continue to support them, and we will. I mean, CJA is already, doing what we can to support our members that are there, and then other groups that are doing work on this. And so, but yeah, we have to move at the pace of urgency, and we have to move at the pace of urgency of how do we end harms to communities. So
Yes.
you might have one more question. I just want to share a couple of stories of communities who are doing cool dynamic stuff before we totally wrap up. And we'll just be quick.
Of course. Yeah. So the final question was just how can communities get on the radar of CJA? So there are many low-income communities of color in particular that may be affected by environmental justice issues or environmental injustice issues, and not feeling like they have the visibility or the support to resist the obvious, right? And to build the alternatives that are needed. And so if folks wanted to get involved or look for a CJA to support, how can they do that? Who do they talk to?
So we have 89 members. I would say over half of those are local organizations in states. We call them building our power communities. And they're in regions all across the country. I think we have, I always mix up the number of our regions with the number of EPA regions. So we either have 6 or 8, and I can't remember which one is the EPA regions or our regions. But I would say, check out the website, look at, and there's a map. You can see where folks are. If there's somebody that is close, either in your state or in your region, reach out to them and check in. But we have a number of regional organizers. You can find them on our website. And if you're in one of those regions, reach out to them and check in and see like if there's opportunities that you can connect with something that's going on locally, or a meeting or a town hall that one of the local groups are hosting, and connect with them. And yeah, well, I mean, we have a process for like getting folks in as members, but also like things come up and we support where we can. We don't have any members in Ohio yet. We responded and reached out when like the derailment happened in Ohio, and trying to like figure out like how do we support what's happening locally there, and reaching out to some organizations that we knew in adjacent states. And so, but yeah, there's ways to connect, and sometimes there's national things that we're doing, and we're like calling people to show up different places. But yeah, I would say those are the starting points.
Awesome. Thank you. So the floor is open for you to share the stories, and I'm super excited to listen.
So I don't know if I have access to slides again, but I have a couple more slides that just show a few of the stories. I shared one from the Southwest Organizing Project, is one of our member organizations. They have that Project Feed the Hood. This is, this was one of the initiatives that we did a few years back, 2018, in response to California's governor doing this climate summit. But it really started to get us to ask this question about like false solutions, and these are just some questions that help us like think about like who's making the decision, who's going to benefit, and what else will this impact. And so we have to think about those in the solutions that come up, like how else is this going to impact? So Little Village Environmental Justice Organization is in Illinois, Chicago, and doing farming in the city, in community, in Little Village. And what does that mean? Like both sort of reclamation of abandoned land or empty lots, but also shifting like the policies around who gets to use the land, where does that food go? But you create localized sources of food, right? This is one of their initiatives, where the people can access the food more locally and not having to buy things that come, distances greater than 5,000 miles sometimes. And so this is one of those. And, both this is sort of addressing the problem in when localizing food, the distances that people have to use fossil fuels to access food gets eliminated. And then they're also creating, plant life that is helping clean the air, but also creating economic opportunity for people in that community and local community. Urban Till, similarly based in Richmond, California. Richmond being the sort of place of one of the largest oil refineries in the country, not the largest, but one of the larger ones, that also had, has had a number of, or has had a pretty serious environmental catastrophe some years back, right? And so people came together, like, both to organize around that refinery, but also in their efforts around fighting the bad, but also like, what are they creating? Creating a place for farming, for food, localized food that was relevant to their communities. And they're now having to take on, well, I think they won. Actually, they did win. They had to take on a corporation who they had just had this beautiful farm. They like raised the money to buy the land so they could have this farm. And then a piece of land that was next to them got bought by a company to build this high-rise parking structure. To build a high-rise parking structure that would have essentially blocked all of the sun that they had just like had this beautiful farm growing. So had to like work through city council and organizing to, you know, to challenge the permitting of that parking structure, and has since won. That parking structure will no longer be built there and blocking the sun from their farm, that they're like providing low cost or free food to the community, and work opportunities for community members, and also learning opportunities for young people. These are some other organizations who are, you know, this is not even all of them. This is just a handful that I grabbed. But these are some of the anchors for CJA who are holding. We have a food sovereignty working group, and these are some of the anchor organizations there. But there are lots of organizations who are doing work around localized food, farming, local agriculture. And there are a few who are also looking at like more localized energy sources and how they can, you know, do local community solar or local community wind as ways. And some of them are doing both farming and wind and solar. So I just wanted to share these as just some examples for y'all to think through. But that's it for me. I mean, I'm happy to answer any more questions if there's time, but I also know there's time to if there's any other wrap up things to do.
Great.
And I think whoever grabbed the websites that I was mentioning and dropped them in the chat, y'all should check out those the regenerative economy and all of that. So
Yes, please do. And yeah, the website is in the chat. CJA, yep, crimejusticealliance.org is in the chat. And I think that addresses some of the questions that we recently got in the Q&A box on if CJA operates trinationally. All of that information is available on the website.
yeah, I mean, we I would say it's less tri-nationally, but definitely engaging in the international sort of field of like what's being decided on an international level in terms of climate change and climate policy. You know, we've always made sure that people have participated in the UN framework on climate change Conference of the Parties. The last one was in Egypt. And those places have also been very challenging in terms of indigenous peoples, because they're pretty much dominated by corporations, and it's like a trade show for fossil fuel development. That's what they've become to know for me, but still, that's been also important space for us to engage with other communities, other movements, farm workers movement, the land back movement, other work that has been, you know, around trade and economy and health and well-being of land and communities. And so, yes, but I wouldn't call it exclusively a Mexico, Canada, US piece, but definitely there's some work happening there.
Awesome. Thank you. And just a big expression of gratitude from everyone. You are phenomenal, so amazing. I love to hear you talk. And yeah, I hope that everyone has taken many pieces away that will help them take action appropriately, you know, holding corporations accountable and so on, for climate resiliency and justice for our community and our people. So we're going to move to the word cloud. This is how we usually end our sessions. You know what to do. Put one word using the code. You can scan the QR code. You can even put it in the chat if you really like, but please scan the QR code or visit the link in the chat and share one word so that we can generate a word cloud for Bineshi before we exit.
Technically, my email is on that website. So if you go,
So you can find me. So yeah, you're welcome to. I may not immediately see it, but Haley, who I work with closely, she'll probably see it before I do, and will let me know. But yeah, you can connect. You can find me.
Okay, thank you. All right, fall solutions, community justice, carbon, food sovereignty, veggie backing, authenticity, resistance, relationship, relative coalition, caribou fight. Let's go Rangers. See that right? Land diversity, land bank, land back, climate, action, interconnectedness, Columbus. Yes, lots of Dominion. Yes, that's a really good one. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. And we'll be sure to send this along to you, Bineshi, in a separate email. All right. Peace,
Oh,
everybody. Have a
thank
good
you.
one.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe some of y'all who are like have a better grasp on English than I do, but I've always wondered like what is the opposite concept of dominion? I mean, I'm sure there's a word there, but yeah, I mean, I just think of it as family, community, relatives. But yes,
Mhm.
wonder what the opposite of dominion is.
Yes, that's a nice closing out. Let's all ponder that. Have a good evening, everybody. Peace.
Thank you all. It was great to see everyone, and thank you for listening to me ramble on. But I hope I wish you all well in your learning and continuing to learn and learning to how you want to engage. I also want to leave y'all with an invitation to find ways to connect with groups in your community, and because there's enough work to go around for all of us.